right into the agenda. We will have Michael Sadowski kick off the presentation discussing science-based targets for apparel. Tim Greiner will then speak about laying the foundations, and Liam Salter will discuss driving change. And at the end, we will have our Q&A portion. Okay, I'll hand it over to you guys.
So this is Tim speaking, just a brief introduction to who's presenting today. So Pure Strategies, Reset Carbon, and World Resources Institute, each with different types of experience we're bringing to the table today to provide this webinar for you. The strategy expertise of Pure Strategies, the environmental footprint and on-the-ground team in Asia with Reset Carbon, and the thought leadership and really organizer, co-organizer of science-based targets with World Resources Institute. And just briefly, Reset and Pure Strategies have come together to offer science-based target services to the apparel brands and retailer sector. And so we're really excited to have this opportunity to talk through today both what are science-based targets, how to go about setting them, the process, and then the most important area is really how we drive change to achieve some of these really ambitious goals that science-based targets asks of the industry. So with that, I'll hand it over to Michael.
Excellent. So Rita, you'll drive the slides for me, so thank you for that. And good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you guys are located. And thanks again for your patience. What I will do over the next 10 minutes or so is just provide an overview of the science-based targets guidance setting process, the objectives, the scope, the criteria, the timeline, as well as give you a sense for how you might get engaged in the process. And so Rita, if you could flip to the next slide, please. So the overarching objective of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is to mobilize companies to set science-based targets and really drive competitive advantage as we transition to a low-carbon economy. Importantly, the SBTi is more than the apparel sector, so it's looking at companies across all sectors, and we're taking a deep dive on the apparel and footwear sector through this guidance development process. Next slide, please, Rita. So just some table setting here. So what is a science-based target? It's a greenhouse gas reduction target aligned with the latest climate science, and I'll speak to that in a moment. It defines how much and how quickly companies need to cut their emissions as they contribute to the global reductions that are required, and gives companies a clear vision on where they need to be in the future. And it really is a challenge to help transform companies and their business models as we drive towards this low carbon economy. Next slide, please, Rita. I can share through Rita some of the more detailed documents that describe the science behind the SBTi, but I get a lot of questions about what exactly is a science-based target. And so you can see the text on this slide. The magnitude of the cuts that are required globally, so 49 to 72% reductions in carbon emissions by 2050 using a 2010 baseline. And so that's to keep within a 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase. If we're talking about a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, the cuts are even deeper. But I can, again, share with you more information about that. So that's what the science is requiring. And some of you on the phone have no doubt already submitted science-based targets for review by the initiative, but just as a recap for others, it's a 4-step process. So a company commits to setting a science-based target. So you may have a good handle on how to do this, or you may not, but you commit to setting the target. That's step 1. You actually then work with your teams, maybe some outside consultants to develop the science-based target. You submit that science-based targets for review. And the initiative, just to recap, is comprised of 4 entities. So CDP, UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. So those groups are responsible for reviewing the submitted targets to determine if they indeed meet the criteria, and we'll speak to those in a moment. And then the fourth step, the final step, is announcing the science-based target. Companies have 2 years from when they commit to actually having a final target. So quite a few companies, and we'll speak to those 17 companies that have committed, they have 2 years from when you announce it to actually when you actually have to have a final released target. Next slide, please, Rita. So there's a lot of words on this slide, pardon that, but I'll kind of call out the main points here. So there are 5 criteria required to achieve an approved SBT. The first is around the boundaries for scope 1 and 2, so it needs to include all greenhouse gas emissions as required by the GHG Protocol corporate standard. In terms of time frame, it needs to be at least a 5-year target, but no longer than a 15-year target. So doing the math today, so it can't go beyond 2033, for example. Level of ambition, it needs to be consistent, and we're talking scope 1 and 2 here, it needs to be consistent with what the science requires. So I showed the percentage cuts on the previous slide. Intensity targets are eligible, but they need to drive absolute reductions in line with the science. So that's a third. Scope 3, and for the apparel sector, this is a big one because much of the emissions for the sector lie within scope 3. Companies must do a screening of their scope 3 emissions. If scope 3 comprises more than 40% of total emissions, then a scope 3 target is required. So you do the math, you count up all scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. If scope 3 is 40% or higher, you must include a scope 3 target that's ambitious and measurable. And that target must include the majority of your value chain emissions. And we can certainly talk more about the different categories that comprise scope 3. But just keep in mind, it's that 40% figure, and then it's the majority figure. And then the last criterion is reporting. So on an annual basis, and you can do that through a corporate report, through CDP and other formats, you have to disclose your inventory and do that on an annual basis. Okay, so those are the 5 criteria. Rita, if you can advance, please. So why apparel and footwear? As many of you, I am sure, are well aware, the sector is large, it's growing. There are some data points up on the slide. The rise of fast fashion, the growth of emerging economies. There's just a lot more apparel being produced, and it's becoming more and more of a significant contributor to the global carbon footprint. And consumers are keeping things less longer than they used to. And so the sector does not have specific guidance like others do. And so through conversations with organizations like the SAC and others, it was determined that guidance was necessary to provide companies with direction on how to tackle tricky areas like purchase goods and services, use phase, et cetera. So that's why we're developing this guidance. Next slide, please, Rita. So the objectives of the guidance. One, we're trying to identify the barriers that companies are seeing as they think about setting science-based targets. And I've got a list of those barriers that we've gathered through stakeholder feedback. So Rita, we can certainly make those available through the webinar email afterwards. We want to create specificity and consistency with how companies are setting SBTs. We know that companies are using different approaches, they're accounting for things differently, so we are trying to provide a level playing field. Importantly, this third point, we're trying to define and provide examples of best practice. So for example, we know that scope 3 is significant, we know that purchase goods and services are significant, and we also know the inherent challenges to that. For example, data quality, availability, et cetera. So we're trying to highlight companies that are doing things well in this space so that companies that want to set targets can look at those as benchmarks. And then lastly, We want to provide a platform for collaboration amongst companies. Likewise, we know that some of the big pockets of emissions are deep upstream, and we know that no one company can really tackle those emissions. And so collective action is going to be required to drive reductions that are needed to meet SBTs. Okay. So the scope of the guidance, and actually just this week we are talking with the expert advisory group that we have for the work to go through a detailed outline for the guidance. So this is what you see on screen here is a very high level outline. And again, Rita, we can share with the group what that outline looks like after the call. But just at a high level, some of the topics that will be included in the guidance, the business case for setting SBTs, and how to choose SBT method, pros and cons, boundary, choosing a base year, intensity versus absolute, et cetera. A whole range of things around scope 3 targets, and as I mentioned, some of the trickier areas like use phase and purchase goods and services. There'll be a section on best practices, as well as other initiatives in the industry that are trying to drive emissions down, and then a conversation about how to effectively engage suppliers. Okay, so that's kind of a high-level scope, and I can certainly provide more detail after the call. Okay. Next slide, Rita, please. So to date, I would say Kering is the one kind of pure apparel and footwear company that has an agreed and approved science-based target. I won't read that language, but it's available in the public domain. And then Marks and Spencer and Walmart, 2 retailers that sell apparel, have approved SBTs. And so, again, this is all in the public domain, and you can also see the full list of approved targets and committed targets on the sciencebasedtargets.org website, if you're interested in that. Okay, so those are the approved. Rita, if you flip to the next slide, these are the companies that have committed to setting an SBT, and apologies, there seems to be a graphical issue there, but these are all companies that have taken that first step and have committed to an SBT and are somewhere in the process of developing their SBTs. And these are companies, many of which we've spoken with, and they're in that process. Okay. The timeline, really just know that this kicked off back in June. There was a webinar that my colleagues Nate and Cynthia presented. And where we are today is we are speaking with this expert advisory group, as I mentioned, about the outline. We have a goal of developing a first draft of the guidance to be shared with all stakeholders by the springtime. That would actually set us up to be able to show up at the SAC conference in May to be able to have a conversation with the industry about the guidance. And so ultimately, we are trying to drive towards a fall, kind of early winter final release for the guidance. And there'll be a big rollout plan. And importantly, we need to take this to all actors in the supply chain. So it's not just brands and retailers, but for example, we want to make sure that all of the players across the tiers of the value chain are engaged, because it's not just for brands and retailers, it's for tier 1 manufacturers, tier 2, et cetera. Okay. Rita, I think that might be it, but yeah, so you have my email there, so thank you for your attention and time. We would love feedback, questions, participation. I mentioned there's an expert advisory group, so it's about 25 folks that have particular expertise in carbon accounting or life cycle assessment, but we have a larger stakeholder advisory group that really is getting updates from us, but we also will send the outline and the draft guidance. But if you have questions, comments, examples of how your company is addressing these tough areas like purchase goods and services, we'd love to get your feedback. So that's it for me, and I think I'm handing it to Tim.
Thanks, Michael. So Rita, we can jump right to the next slide. I think that the contribution and that WRR is making is so significant, clearly because of the difficulty in setting science-based targets in the sector. When we look at the distribution of emissions across the value chain in the retail sector, in the apparel sector, we see mostly that the emissions are really, as Michael said earlier, they're really in scope 3. There's relatively a minor level of emissions in either direct emissions as scope 1 or indirect emissions as scope 2. And the way that the standard reads is there's what we call 15 categories of different scope 3 emissions, and they're figured on this diagram here. And there are two areas in particular that probably where most of the apparel and footwear scope 3 emissions will come from, as Michael said, purchased goods and services, as well as the use of sold products. So we can go to the next slide. Just as a graphic to show you from one company's experience looking at carbon in their value chain, Nike published their carbon profile for scope 3, and we can see that raw materials and raw materials manufacturing and finished goods manufacturing comprise the vast majority of their scope 3 impacts. Consumer use is significant as well. Including consumer use in your science-based target is not required because it's considered indirect energy use associated with the product. It would be different, for example, if you were manufacturing cars where the product had direct energy use. So in the case of apparel or footwear, that's indirect energy use. And however, if you're interested in including the consumer use phase in your target, I know that the science-based target community encourages it, and that's going to be part of the guidance that Michael talked about. So, I'm going to focus my remarks here really on how to think through setting the science-based targets, laying the foundation for the hard work that comes when you try to implement them. But in doing so, we've kind of laid out a process that we think is a logical process for thinking through how you gather the data and create your baseline and your target. So Rita, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in this target setting process, the first phase is really getting ready. It's really doing that work of estimating where the emissions are, both for scope 1 and scope 2, which generally many companies have a pretty good sense already of that, but also for scope 3. And that includes those creating estimates for those 15 categories. And I'll talk through in a minute some of the tools that you can use to estimate those scope 3 emissions. But once you've really thought through and done those estimates for scope 3, then you've got to think through where do we want to set our target? Do we want to include just purchased goods and services? Do we want to include all of purchased goods and services, or should we just focus on a portion of our emissions? For example, if we're a retailer and we're selling our own private label and branded products, do we want to include all of those emissions associated with our product and the branded products we sell, or do we want to focus in on just a portion of those emissions? Once you've made that target setting decision, and that's not a simple decision, the next phase that we're looking at is really how to identify and prioritize the data collection you need to do. So the data collection here component is really around setting your baseline. We can move to the next slide, please, Rita. So here it's about setting the baseline for your improvement opportunities. So if we look at phase 2, you're both developing your baseline and you're understanding where your hotspots are among the areas that you're including in your target, and assessing the key drivers and trying to prioritize those improvement opportunities. And at that point in this process, you're really ready to engage SBTi on your target ambition. So once you've gotten through phase 2, and I apologize, it looks like there's a slight it's a title missing for phase 3, but scenario and targets is really for phase 3. And here's where you begin modeling the reduction initiatives. So you're looking based upon the hotspots for where carbon lies in the portion of the scope 3 emissions that you're targeting. You're going to start modeling various what ifs. What if we drove energy efficiency in tier 1 and tier 2? What if we sourced some of our raw materials differently using recycled content or, for example, a better cotton, or a different raw material input for cotton? So as you model these different reduction opportunities, you begin to see what the impact can be on your baseline and begin to think through what your target might look like. Then you go through the process of internal target approval, and it might be in this point where you're also doing some of the proof points around the business case here, specifically the financial investment that might be required given the type of target that you're setting. And the last phase here is your submission of these targets to the SBTi and getting their approval and building a roadmap and building it through execution. And throughout this process, what we found is it's really important to engage stakeholders. Those are both your internal stakeholders, your sourcing teams, your execs, the product design teams, and then equally importantly is some of those external stakeholders. Your suppliers, for example, are going to be critical, particularly because most of the emissions are lying in your value chain. They're going to be critical to include in your process. And maybe your most strategic suppliers are worth querying to understand where they think they can drive improvements. So that's an overview of the target setting process. We can go to the next slide, Rita. Thank you. So as Michael said earlier, when you do this initial assessment, if scope 3 is more than 40% of your value chain emissions, then you must develop a target covering at least 2/3 of scope 3 emissions or the top 3 scope 3 categories. Much of this early work to developing your baseline requires you to find data that you might not have today, and it's really a big challenge. So the Science-Based Targets team has provided some resources. For example, there's the Scope 3 Evaluator tool, which you'll find at ghgprotocol.org, and that can be useful to get an initial cut at your Scope 3 emissions. We've found it useful to leverage any existing corporate Scope 3 inventory data you might have through HIG, for example. And similarly, we find an important step here is to look at your internal data, whether that's on the fabric you're sourcing or the volumes in terms of pieces, because you really want to try to build out what your baseline is going to look like and understand throughout your entire assortment really where you're going to focus your targets and where the hotspots are in those focus areas. So an ideal way to do this is to look at some of the secondary emission factors from life cycle inventory databases, from HIG MSI. There's a World Apparel Life Cycle Database, and there are some published life cycle studies as well. And government agencies also have some useful tools. For example, WRAP out of the UK has developed a tool that helps brands and retailers to understand the impacts of end of life, using recycled content, and other types of scenarios that you can look at to drive reductions. So I just want to emphasize that the Scope 3 target doesn't have to follow a science-based pathway, but it does need to be leadership. And I think that the document that the Science-Based Targets team is producing will provide greater insights, but as to what constitutes leadership. But if we look at the next slide, we'll see some of the types of goals that they're looking to emphasize here. So from SBT standpoint, the most preferred types of targets are absolute targets, right? Of course, those are quite difficult, absolute targets, particularly in line with a 2-degree pathway, but it's the most preferred. The second would be emissions-based intensity targets, then non-emissions targets in absolute or intensity terms, so reducing energy use, for example, in your value chain. And then the least preferred types of targets are the ones that are maybe more general about influencing the behavior of your suppliers or customers. And it's not like you need to have just a single approach to your target. You could combine a few of these different ones where you would have maybe a consumer influence component to your target for the use phase, and have an absolute emissions target for a portion of your value chain, let's say your most strategic suppliers. And then if you're willing to manage maybe a third area, have a third area around engagement with other portions of your supply chain. So there's a bit of a mix and match potential. And if anything, there's a fair amount of flexibility here, but as you bring that target together, it's really worthwhile to get feedback from SBTi to understand whether your thinking is aligning with their definition of leadership. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Liam.
What I'll look at briefly is some of the options available to companies in the apparel sector for reducing Scope 3 emissions and supply chain emissions in particular. Next slide, please. So I think, you know, what we've seen from science-based targets in other sectors is that these things are, you know, are very specific and very challenging. So, you know, if you're a property company and you run a Scope 1 and 2 target, you end up, you know, looking at something like a 40% emissions reduction by 2030. It automatically becomes a sort of one of your most challenging sustainability exercises. When we start looking at Scope 3, as Tim and Michael have been talking about, it becomes much less prescriptive, and many more options are available to companies to choose targets. And so I think that means that from a business perspective, it's that there are more opportunities for aligning the SBT with the priorities that you already have in your company and in your supply chain. The Scope 3 requirements that come from WRI process will still likely provide very important minimum framework for that decision. So I think you know, the process that Michael is leading is really important, because currently now the level of guidance is very, very general, and we will need more specifics in order particularly to understand what the minimum threshold and what the minimum acceptable level will be. One example of that, for example, would be data quality. You know, if we look at how many brands collect supply chain data quality today, it's often suppliers perhaps reporting manually into a software tool. What we've seen is when we look at that data, often, you know, 15 to 20% of it looks quite questionable, and would be difficult to include in a sort of public-facing report, and difficult to use in terms of making a claim about greenhouse gas performance. You know, in this sector, we've got the Higg Index FEM 3.0, which is just coming out now, and which offers potential for, you know, putting a verified data set from suppliers together. And we're also looking at companies exploring automated data capture. So, you know, there are solutions being explored, but thinking carefully about how we involve the data question into our strategy will be important, because we need to make sure that whatever actions we're taking will be properly presented both internally and then to the public. You know, I think another thing that's worth considering is suppliers' perspectives, and we do a lot of work at Reset directly with suppliers. Many suppliers are pretty nervous about SBTs. They don't really know what to expect. They're concerned when they look at some of the commitments already made in public, that it could be some fairly demanding requests from their customers. But on the flip side, I think what we're also seeing is leading suppliers are also looking at their own science-based targets for their own businesses. So I think, you know, there are opportunities to talk to suppliers about how to do this. And I think certainly when brands make decisions about what they want to do, communicating effectively to suppliers will be important, because there's likely to be quite a lot of innovation in whatever we choose. Next slide, please. So again, we're just reiterating the Nike slide here in a way. I mean, there's sort of 3 other products. What we see when we look at how emissions are spread across the value chain is we see, you know, raw materials and manufacturing usually the largest share, not always a majority, and use phase, you know, as with the Nike slide, becoming often the second most important of the scope 3 categories. So really the sort of the purple and the yellow, which would be looking at raw materials and manufacturing, and then the orange there is looking at use phase, will probably be most of what most people do. I think in this presentation, you know, due to limits of time, we'll talk about raw materials and manufacture. Next slide, please. So what I've tried to do here is just jot down some opportunities. And most of these are taken from our own sort of project experiences. So I've anonymized a lot of this data. Really the objective here is to show you some examples of the different things that people have done. And none of these have been SBT projects. These have all been other pieces of work that people have done. But what we can see here is there's a pretty large range of options available, which is exciting. I mean, I think it shows that SBTs can really be brought in a way that helps reinforce existing programs rather than something completely new. So just to pick a few examples, I mean, we've seen that BCI cotton delivers a carbon reduction, although, you know, actually the cotton country of origin also can deliver some quite significant differences in the carbon footprint of the cotton. So, you know, the difference between Brazil, India and China, for example, because Brazil has a electricity grid mainly coming from large dams, is quite sizable. Recycled cotton, particularly if we're not re-dyeing, gives some huge reductions. You know, biopolyester, recycled polyester, these kinds of things will also give reductions. On the manufacturing side, we've seen across the board, you know, 15 to 20% emissions reductions from energy efficiency. We've started to look now at on-site renewables such as solar, which, depending upon the size of the factory, really can give you anywhere between 5 and 50% of factory level emissions reductions. And we see a lot of process improvements also delivering carbon reductions alongside water and other savings. So stuff like cold pad batch dyeing, variety of different low water washing techniques. CO2 dyeing looks pretty promising. So again, incorporating suppliers with these kinds of equipment into the program will deliver some pretty big reductions. And even something, you know, design is obviously an area that has huge potential, particularly reducing weight is going to reduce carbon. And we've seen, you know, use of lightweight fabrics on a per piece basis, reducing, you know, up to 60% in some cases. So I think, you know, the key takeaway here is lots of different opportunities. Many of these different solutions are already at play in the supply chain, many being used in commercial context. The challenge really is going to be scaling rather than, you know, doing sort of crazy new things that have never been done before. It's really about picking up on the stuff that has the strongest business case and scaling it across the supply chain so that we deliver those significant carbon reductions that SBT requires. Next slide, please. So just one example, This is an old customer of ours. It's Lee. They did a green denim range called Rethink a few years ago. And what was interesting about this, and the reason I wanted to talk about it, was what they did was they intervened at multiple points in the supply chain and aggregated the savings across the different measures. So they used BCI, they used recycled PET. They worked with a very efficient dye mill with a number of strong process improvements, and they also worked with a very efficient laundry. And when they stacked all of those together, you know, on a per piece basis, they got somewhere in between 40 and 50% reductions depending upon the product. You know, and that was a regular product. It looked like a normal pair of jeans. It priced like a normal pair of Lee jeans, but it was 40% less carbon. So I think that for us is really, you know, an excellent indicator of the potential for driving significant carbon savings, whilst, you know, maintaining a strong business case and an excellent product. Next slide, please. So I'm quite conscious of the time. I'll move fairly quickly through these slides. This is a set of results from a piece of work that we did for a vertical fabric manufacturer who asked us to help them build a footprint for different types of fabric that they manufactured. And I think the interesting thing here is, you know, there's a huge range in the carbon footprint of a range of different fabrics from the same supplier and the same site. So certainly going and talking to suppliers, and especially verticals and big, you know, fabric producers about the different fabric options available for the products that you're using, and throwing carbon into that mix, making carbon an issue that your top vendors can have a look at and play around with, will likely yield some interesting opportunities. As I said, all of these were commercial fabrics. In some cases, they were interchangeable, but you know, nobody had asked the supplier at that point that this was a sort of a purchase criterion. So there are definitely options there that will require a solid dialogue with Tier 2 to sort of bring them out. Next slide, please. This is energy efficiency. I mean, I think we are getting increasingly familiar with this opportunity in this sector, you know, through programs like Clean by Design. Basically, it's pretty solid. This shows a range of different sites. Southeast Asia, 20% energy savings potential, 2.5-year payback. There are still a lot of energy saving opportunities within the sector, especially in the Tier 2, and the paybacks are excellent. They do sometimes take time to bring out. So, for example, we have a customer now where the savings potential, it's a big mill. They've got about a $2 million saving potential. It's going to take us 3 or 4 years to get there. But it's all affordable, it's all existing technology, and it's something that the management is very comfortable implementing. So focusing on energy efficiency is going to yield excellent economics for the carbon reductions. Next slide, please. Another thing that we're starting to see coming is on-site solar. This was you know, relatively uncommon up to about you know, a year or two ago. What this slide here shows is, again, the different payback periods across a range of different markets. And you know, we're seeing 4 to 10 years, I would say, across East and Southeast Asia at the moment. Those prices are affordable for many large suppliers. And what we're also starting to see now is innovative financing mechanisms that take the capital expense away from the factory and put that onto the developer. So in Cambodia at the moment, you know, apparel Tier 1 vendors are contracting power purchase agreements with on-site solar providers at a discount to their current tariff, and using a contract length somewhere around 10 to 15 years. So we're seeing already in the more expensive power markets, apparel factories doing commercial contracts for PV rooftops that's taking a large chunk of their carbon out, and we're expecting that to continue. In the interest of time, I'll skip my final slide, and I think we can now move on to the next section. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Leah, Michael, and Tim. And thank you again to all of our attendees in the beginning as we were figuring out that technical glitch. So we'll now get to some of your questions. And as I mentioned, if we don't have time for everything, our speakers today have agreed to email back an answer for you. So we'll start off with this one from Kayla. She asks, many of the businesses mentioned are large established corporations. Can you make high-level recommendations to new independent businesses for incorporating best practices informed by science-based targets?
This is Michael. I'll just say that the guidance is not directed towards a company of any particular size. So regardless of the size of the company, the guidance is going to be applicable. It so happens that the companies that have committed are larger brands and retailers and some suppliers. But the guidance itself is great for $1 million company. It's great for $1 billion company and beyond. So I think as you see the guidance come out over the next few months, you'll see that it's meant to address companies of all sizes.
Great, thank you, Michael. We have a question from Corey, who asks, curious whether any of you have looked at emissions as related to circularity, i.e., in addition to use of recycled materials, do you see carbon reduction and shifts of business models from new production to grow resale and leasing models?
Yeah, Tim and Liam, I'll start if you guys want to chime in, please. But that's an area that the guidance is going to address. There happens to be another strand of work that WRI is leading, trying to understand the environmental impact of alternative models, whether they be repair, subscription, other things like reuse, et cetera. It's a pretty complex topic to dig into, but I think we all know intuitively that if you keep a garment in life longer, you repair it, there are going to be carbon benefits. And so that separate body of WRI work is trying to get a handle on those impacts. If you're interested in learning more about that, just pop me a note.
Great.
This is Tim. I'll just quickly add that we've looked at leasing arrangements for products in other sectors and have seen real significant shifts in carbon. So, for example, in the pallet industry, when you look at a leasing arrangement and the ability to make the pallet more durable, repairable, and recoverable, that those types of product design decisions tend to reduce the lifetime carbon associated with that product. So, I think it would easily then apply also to the apparel sector.
Great, thanks, Tim. We have another question. This was from Pankaj. He asked, what is the criteria for selecting a baseline?
Assuming he means year, in terms of baseline, the initiative is flexible as long as you're not accounting or taking credit for emissions that have already been banked, if you will. So if you're setting a target today and submit a baseline of 2010, the initiative won't give you credit for the reductions that you've already achieved over that period. They want to see fresh reductions, and critically, the target date needs to be at least 5 years. So if you set it today, it needs to be a 2023 target and cannot be longer than a 15-year target. But there's some flexibility in the baseline year.
That's great.
And I'll add, for apparel companies, sometimes they're more on seasons than they are on a calendar year basis. So, but to underscore what Michael said, the baseline should cover a year-long basis. It could be your fiscal year, or it could be a calendar year. But it should cover a year, and then you would report annually on changes to that baseline.
Okay, thank you, Tim. It looks like there aren't any other questions. If there are, please type them in now. And in the meantime, I'll I'll just conclude. I wanted to thank again our speakers today, Tim Greiner, Michael Sadowski, and Liam Salter. It was really a informative, great presentation, so thank you so much for that. And a reminder to everyone on, we will send out tomorrow the recorded video presentation of this, as well as the PDF copy. And yes, that'll be sent to you by email. And if there aren't any other questions, I believe we'll conclude a few minutes early, but to the speakers, if you want to add anything, I'll let you take the time to do so now.
Yeah, Rita, this is Michael. I'll just say that, as I mentioned earlier, the guidance is really trying to provide, areas of best practice for the industry. So if folks on the call think that they have some good ideas, some creative ideas for getting at these tricky areas like use phase or purchase goods and services, WRI really welcomes hearing those examples. And so feel free to email me, and we'll also be sending out to the full stakeholder list, the outline, as well as the draft guidance in the coming weeks and months. So, Rita, we can connect offline about how to make sure that folks on this call are getting that as well. So thank you.
Yeah, just one last comment from my side, and really also picking up on the question about company size. What we've found is that something like an SBT is going to be impacted by the quality of your supplier relationship. So companies that have strong relationships with their suppliers and have kind of done a lot of value-added stuff with them before will find programs like SBTs go flow much more easily and more successfully. We think that some of the best examples from our sort of customer base have been smaller companies with kind of quite tight supply chains and strong longer-term supplier relationships. And they tend to drive these programs much faster. So I think it's really, it's about the ability to have a sort of value-added discussion with your strategic suppliers that's going to be one of the key indicators here, rather than, say, something like company size.
That's great. Thank you for that, Liam. And I did see a few of the questions just come in, but since we're just about a minute to the top of the hour, I'll make sure that they are all responded by email from our speakers. So thank you for that. And again, thank you to our speakers and to all attendees. We hope you enjoyed today's Textile Exchange webinar, and be on the lookout for the email that will come in tomorrow where you could receive this.